Today's case is unlike anything seen on this channel before. We've explored criminal duos before, but never a romantic couple, specifically a serial killing couple. Between 1967 and 1987, Fred West, along with his wife Rose, committed about 12 murders in the most gruesome manner imaginable. Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we will be looking at the case of Fred and Rose West. Fred was born on September 29, 1941, to his father, Walter Stephen West, and his mother, Daisy Hannah West. Born in Much Merkel, Herefordshire, in Bickerton Cottage, Fred was the first child of his parents. His parents were farm workers who barely made any money, so Fred grew up in a poor environment. Walter was not a fan of indiscipline, so he was quite strict with his children. On the other hand, his mother Daisy was mostly overprotective. In 1946, Fred's parents left Bickerton Cottage for Moorcourt Cottage in Moorcourt Farm. There, his father occupied two positions. He worked as a harvest hand and also as a milking herdsman. There was no electricity in the cottage, so the family had to make do with a log fireplace. By 1951, Daisy had already birthed 8 children, although only 6 of them survived. Meanwhile, it was said that growing up, Fred was Daisy's favorite child. Everyone called him Mommy's boy. Walter and Daisy West organized their home in such a way that their children had shared responsibilities. While the girls were assigned to picking strawberries and hops, the boys were assigned to hunting rabbits and harvesting wheat. From quite a young age, Daisy taught her 6 children the importance of work and survival. This knowledge instilled in Fred a solid work ethic because, along the line, Fred got into petty theft also to make ends meet. In school, Fred was described as a scruffy, lethargic, and one who always got himself into trouble. Fred showed great apathy towards school activities, so he was hardly literate. However, he had a knack for handiwork, particularly woodwork and artwork. In December 1956, Fred dropped out of school and took to working full-time in Moorcourt Farms with his parents. By 1957, Fred, along with his brother John, had become frequent visitors at a youth group in Ledbury. It was said that he was always hounding and pestering females, whom he viewed as sources of pleasure. He would, most times, approach girls and fondle them without consent. Just after Fred turned 17, he purchased a motorcycle, and 8 weeks after that, he got into an accident that left him with a fractured skull, broken arm, and broken leg. He lost consciousness for a week and had to walk with crutches for months after he regained consciousness. Due to his accident, Fred came to develop a certain dislike for hospitals and gave himself to throwing fits of rage. 2 years after the accident, Fred further suffered an injury to the head. It was said that there had been a fire outbreak, and while everyone was scampering to safety, Fred groped a female who then punched him so that he lost his balance and fell 2 floors. His loved ones would soon find out about Fred's sexual crimes in the worst way possible. In June 1961, Kitty, Fred's 13-year-old sister, opened up and reported to their mother that Fred had been forcibly sleeping with her and that she was pregnant as a result. Immediately, Fred was reported to the police and was arrested in no time. He confessed to the police that he had always molested young girls, even as a teenager. He was tried on November 9th of the same year, but the case was dropped later because Kitty refused to testify against him. Regardless, his family cut off all contact with him as his mother sent him away. Fred then moved in with his aunt in the Much Merkel house. Around mid-1962, he had reconciled with his parents, but their relationship remained strained. As time passed, Fred met Catherine Costello, and the two got romantically involved. On November 17, 1962, the two got married, even as Catherine was pregnant with another man's child. Catherine moved in with Fred in the Much Merkel house, but they later moved to Coatbridge. There, Fred began work as the driver of an ice cream van. Catherine put to bed in March 1963, and she bore a beautiful girl who she named Charmaine. Shortly after, the family moved to the Bridgeton district of Glasgow. A little later down the line, Catherine fell pregnant to Fred, and in July 1964, she gave birth to a baby girl named Anna Marie. Neighbors at their Savoy Street home said that while Catherine was very loving to their daughters, Fred was not. Isa McNeil, the children's nanny, particularly stated that the girls were usually kept underneath a bunk bed with bars caging them in. The only time they were allowed to come out was when Fred was not home. Through Isa, Fred and Catherine came to know Anne McFall. Anne was Isa's 16-year-old friend who was going through depression because she had just lost her boyfriend. Seeking comfort, she spent most of her time with Isa and, by default, was always in the West's home. One day, Fred admitted to Catherine that he had another child outside their marriage. Out of fury, Catherine in turn jumped into an affair with a man known as John McLachlan. The first time Fred caught Catherine hugging John, he threw a punch in her face and a fight ensued. John punched Fred and Fred replied by stretching his abdomen with a knife. John didn't take that lying down as he threw another punch Fred's way, which made Fred back out of the fight. John later revealed that although Fred didn't have the guts to confront men like himself, he was very quick in assaulting women. On one hand, John and Catherine kept up their relationship, and on the other hand, Fred kept assaulting Catherine. On one occasion, John had to go looking for Fred to beat him up as badly as he did Catherine. But that wasn't the last time. John also revealed that he had beat up Fred another time because Fred had hit Charmaine on the head after the little girl asked for ice cream. On the 4th of November 1965, Fred hit a young boy with his ice cream van in Glasgow. Although the boy died from the accident, Fred was acquitted by the police because it appeared that Fred had hit the boy by accident. However, Fred was scared of what the locals would do to him, especially since he was dependent on them to earn a living. He decided to move back to Gloucester with his daughters. The three lived in a caravan that Fred rented in Bishop's Cleeve, precisely at the Timberland Caravan Park. In February 1966, Catherine moved to Gloucester to stay with Fred and their children. She took with her the children's nanny, Isa McNeil and Anne McFall. It turned out that both women had chosen to go with her because, coming from poor backgrounds, they sought a better life. Shortly after Fred moved the family south, he got a job as a lorry driver for a slaughterhouse in the area. By early 1966, Fred began to exhibit extreme control over all the women in his life. It was said that he had explosive mood swings. He began taking sexual advantage over Charmaine and even talked Catherine into prostitution so that she could support the family. According to Fred, his earnings as a driver at the local slaughterhouse were not sufficient to cater to the family's needs. One time, Catherine called John to help rescue her and her daughters from Fred, as the level of physical abuse and sexual crimes seemed to have heightened. John opted to help, and they both worked out a plan. However, the day they were supposed to leave, Fred somehow caught up with them. Fred had been having an affair with Anne McFall and had even promised to marry her, so she might have told Fred the plan. The police got involved, but still, Fred took with him Charmaine and Anna Marie. He also threatened to kill Catherine if he ever saw her again. Also, Anne McFall chose to leave with Fred. So, Charmaine and Anne remained in Fred's custody at Bishop's Cleeve, while Catherine made frequent visits to see how they were faring. In July 1967, Anne McFall, who was 18 and already pregnant by Fred, was said to have disappeared. Fred did not have her reported missing. However, various parts of her body were found underneath the ground, at the border of a cornfield between Munch, Merkel, and Kempley. It was said that her 8-month-old child had most likely been cut out of her womb as well. When asked, Fred denied having anything to do with it. However, he later confessed to a visitor that he had killed her with a knife after an argument. A month after that, Catherine went back to live with Fred and the children. Fred then moved them again to the lake house and caravan park. There was a significant improvement to the couple's relationship, but Catherine left a year later, leaving Charmaine and Anna Marie to the devices of Fred again. At times when Fred had no one to look after the girls, he would place them under the care of Gloucestershire Social Services. In 1969, Fred met Rosemary Letts. After wooing her for some time, the two began a relationship, which led Rose to becoming a frequent guest at the Lake House Caravan Park. Initially, Rose doted on the girls and often suggested that Fred take all of them on excursions. Just weeks after meeting Fred, Rose resigned from the bakery she worked at and channeled her time time and energy to babysitting Fred's daughters. Time passed, and Rose felt it was time for Fred to see her parents. Rose's parents were not receptive toward Fred, however. They had even threatened Fred that they would call social services if he didn't leave their daughter alone. Rose, who was 15 at the time, refused to listen to her parents. As a result, her parents called the attention of social services. In response, they placed Rose in a home designated for troubled teenagers. There were conditions in place for whenever she wanted to leave. During weekends, Rose was allowed to return to her parents, but she would also take the time to see Fred. When Rose turned 16, she left the care of social services for her parents' house. She, however, left her parents' house and moved in with Fred in a Cheltenham flat. Shortly after, Fred took Charmaine and Anna out of Gloucestershire social services completely. Rose's father made a final attempt to bring his daughter home. A police surgeon ran some tests on her and found out that she was pregnant. Again, Rose was placed under social services but got discharged on March 6th on the instruction that she would abort the child and go back to her parents. However, her father forbade her from coming back home after she chose to go back to Fred instead. 3 months later, Fred moved the entire family into a 2-story house in Midland Road, Gloucester. On October 17, 1970, Rose gave birth to her first child with Fred, Heather Ann. 2 months later, Fred had to face 25 weeks in prison for car tire theft. He was later released on June 24, 1971. All the while, the girls were under the care of Rose, who treated them badly. One time, a neighbor had walked into their flat unannounced and found Charmaine standing naked on a chair and her hands held together by a belt behind her. Rose stood behind Charmaine holding a big wooden spoon. The real murder frenzy is said to have begun when Rose allegedly killed Charmaine while Fred was still in prison. On the 15th of June, Rose had taken the girls to see Fred in prison. However, when he was released 9 days later, the ex-convict didn't find Charmaine at home. After examining this situation, the authorities concluded that Rose had probably killed Charmaine that very same day or some days after. Whenever anybody asked Rose where Charmaine went, she would say that she had gone with her mom. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Rose had kept Charmaine's body in Midland Road's coal cellar and waited until Fred's release so that they could bury the body somewhere around the back of the flat. In 1971, around August, Catherine visited Moorcourt Cottage to find out where Fred and the children were. After finding out Fred's new home address on Midland Road, Catherine then decided to go confront him. Catherine got there but never returned, and this was because she had been strangled by Fred in his vehicle. Eventually, Catherine's body was found in plastic bags, having been dismembered and buried near a bunch of trees. A metal tube was also found along with her remains, implying that she could have been taken sexual advantage of before her murder. Fred and Rose got married on January 29, 1972, at Gloucester Register Office. Months later, Rose got pregnant with their second child. Again, the family moved from Midland Road to 25 Cromwell Street. This time, Fred bought the property to maintain a level of privacy for his family. In September 1972, Rose and Fred took Anna Marie to the cellar of 25 Cromwell Street and instructed her to take off her clothes. Anna hesitated and Rose began tearing her clothes off with a knife. Anna was then gagged and tied down to be sexually violated by Fred, with Rose watching them. Afterward, Rose warned the young girl not to mention the incident to anyone, saying that Fred only did what any father would do. In October 1972, Rose hired a 17-year-old nanny, Caroline Owens, to babysit her children. However, Caroline left the job shortly after because Fred began making advances at her. On December 6, 1972, the Wests then approached Caroline, apologizing for Fred's behavior months back. Thinking that the Wests truly regretted their actions, Caroline got in the back seat of Fred's car with Rose. Rose began to fondle Caroline so much that she got uncomfortable and tried resisting. Fred then punched her, making her lose consciousness. Caroline was bound, gagged, and sexually assaulted by Fred and Rose. When asked whether she would return to work as their nanny, Caroline agreed, hoping to use that as a means of escape, which she did. On getting home, Caroline narrated her ordeal to her mother, who immediately reported it to the police. The Wests were taken into custody and tried on January 12, 1973. However, Caroline decided that at the time she could not bear retelling what had happened to her, and as such, the case was dropped, and the couple was told to pay a fine of £50 each. 3 months after their release, Fred and Rose committed yet another murder. The victim this time was a 19-year-old named Linda Goff, who lodged at Cromwell Street and had the same sex partners as Rose. On November 10, 1973, the couple also killed 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper. Her dismembered body was found in the cellar, with surgical tape holding her skull together. Lucy Partington and Therese Sigantala were both kidnapped by the Wests on December 27, 1973 and April 16, 1974. Their dismembered bodies were later found in the cellar as well. As time passed, it's safe to say that Fred and Rose were gradually spiraling down the well of aggravated sexual violence and brutality in order to satisfy their perverse desires. Rose ventured into prostitution, and she entertained both male and female clients in her home with the full support of her husband. The disturbed couple enjoyed murdering and assaulting young women and left a ton of bodies in their wake. Some of the West's victims include 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard, 18-year-old Juanita Mott, 18-year-old Shirley Robinson, 16-year-old Allison Chambers, and their daughter, 16-year-old Heather West. A majority of these victims were sexually violated first before their murders and further body dismemberment. After the disappearance of their daughter, Heather West, things began to go south for the murderous couple. Heather's disappearance led to two things in 1994. It called the police's attention to them, and as a result, led to the arrest of Fred and Rose. The couple was charged with the murder of 9 people, while Fred was further charged with 3 extra murders. Before their trial, which was scheduled to be held in November 1995, Fred, who was held in HM Prison Birmingham, ended his life by hanging himself, thereby escaping the judgment of the law. Rose, on the other hand, was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. To this day, Rose, who is now 68 years old, continues to serve her sentence. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of Fred and Rose West, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.